Greetings, fellow musicians of YouTube. My name is Sam Little, and I'm here today to talk to you about how to solo over chord progressions using scales, modes, and arpeggios. We're going to be looking at a simple 2-5-1 chord progression in the key of C major. Most of you will recognize the 2-5-1 as a turnaround progression. In C major, that will be a D minor going to the 5th, which is a G major, going back to the root, which is C major. I often get asked, how can one move around a chord progression safely? The best way to cast your musical safety net is, if you're in the key of C major, just play C major the whole time. Just simply rely on those notes. But a lot of guitar players will find that stale and even a little unconventional. Some guitar players prefer to use C major pentatonic, which is actually more simplified than C major. The C major pentatonic scale is C, D, E, G, A. You're losing the B. It's kind of simpler. You'll find this in a lot of heavy metal stuff. What I want to look at is other ways that you can play that without having to rely on one scale through the entire 3-chord progression. As a bass player with a background in jazz, one of the simplest things that we can do is break down each chord to its individual note, and we do that a lot with what's called a walking bass line. But you can do that with a guitar too to do a solo, but what happens is, for an example, when you do your D minor, which is D, F, and A in the triad, it's a simple triad chord, you only have 3 notes that you can utilize in your solo or in your line, and that really limits what you can do. So what we're going to do is look at how to use other scales and modes and attack each chord as an individual roadmap. That way, instead of relying on C major over the entire progression, we take each chord by itself, break it down, and solo over each chord. And I've actually got a chart to kind of help with that. Our first chord that we're going to approach is the D minor chord, which is the 2nd of our C major scale. In the D minor chord, you can actually use the D minor scale to play over top of that. And the D minor scale is D, which is the root, E, F, which is your 3rd of the chord, G, A, which is your 5th, B flat, C, and D. One thing I want you to keep in mind when you're seeing this is, I have got the red boxes are the individual components of the chord. And you'll notice that every scale and mode that we utilize in this exercise is going to keep with the 3 individual notes of our triads. You may want to use the D minor pentatonic over top of your D minor chord. And D minor pentatonic is D, there's your root, F, which is your 3rd, G, A, which is your 5th, C, and then back to D. Once again, the pentatonic is real popular, but in today's age of music, a lot of players are kind of sliding back, not using the pentatonic as much as they used to. The next scale, which is a scale I rely on quite a bit, is the blues scale. The blues scale is going to give you exactly what it says, a bluesier, more meaty tone to what you're playing. D blues scale is D, which is our root, F, which is our 3rd, G, A flat, A, which is our 5th, and C. And then back to D, of course. All the scales and modes always go back to the root note. The next is a mode, the D Dorian mode. D Dorian is really popular with a lot of old school jazz. Anyone familiar with Miles Davis's work, especially the song So What, will know that the Dorian scale, or Dorian mode, is something that he relies on real heavy. D Dorian is D, once again our root, E, F, which is our 3rd, G, A, which is our 5th, B, C. Dorian will give you a deeper approach to what you're playing. It's a real effective thing when you're coming up with a line over top of the progression, but not something that you see a lot in solo progressions. The next mode we'll approach for a D minor chord is Phrygian. D Phrygian is D, which is a root, E flat, F, which is the 3rd, G, A, which is our 5th, B flat, and C. Phrygian is a real popular mode with bass players because bass players like Stu Hamm and Billy Sheehan and Jaco Pastorius were very, very big on using Phrygian to get that meaty, ballsy sound that they used. The last mode we're going to use is the Aeolian mode, which is also the natural minor. And D Aeolian is D, there's the root, E, F, the 3rd, G, A to the 5th, B flat, and C. Now you'll notice that the Aeolian is actually the same as our natural minor. So really you're playing the same thing, just a different name. With the minor chords and minor progressions, you're going to get a darker, gloomier sound. And this is something that a lot of metal bands capitalize on. And the best example that I can give you is Ozzy Osbourne's popular song, Mr. Crowley, which actually begins on the D minor chord, which is the same chord we have here. When you're utilizing a minor triad chord, sometimes when you make a line around the minor, you want to try to steer away a little bit from the gloomy sound because it can actually cause a solo to come off kind of harsh to the listener. Now we'll move on to the major triad chord, which is our 5th chord, which is going to be the G major. Again, you can simply break it down into its separate parts, G, B, and D, but that's really going to severely limit what you can do as a player. You may want to use G major scale when you're playing over top of a G major chord. G major is G, there's your root, A, B the 3rd, C, D, which is your 5th, E, F sharp, and then back to the octave, which is G. Once again, I'd like to really enforce that you notice that each scale and mode we use is comprised of a series of notes, but it always contains the 3 notes that make up the triad chord that we're using in our progression. You may want to use a G major pentatonic over the G major chord. G major pentatonic is G, as your root note, A, B, which is your 3rd, D, which is your 5th, and E. Again, pentatonic is really popular, but it seems to be losing face with a lot of players in today's music scene. Now we're going to move on to some modes. The G Lydian. Lydian is actually a mode that's common in TV and movies. It's something you hear in the when they roll the credits. It gives you a real over-the-top sound. It's becoming real popular in pop music too. You'll hear a lot of Lydian in Lady Gaga, that sort of sound. And G Lydian is G, there's your root note, A, B, which is your 3rd, C sharp actually, D, which is your 5th, E, and then F sharp. As you can see, we have a root, we have our 3rd, we have our 5th. The last mode that we'll look at in a major progression is G mixolydian. G, there's your root, A, B, the 3rd, C, D, the 5th, E, and F. And really this is a simple way of soloing over a chord progression. Like I said, our chord progression is a pretty easy, basic rundown chord progression. It's nothing complex. We'll get into that in later lessons. But the one thing I want to emphasize to all the players who are watching this is if a note is a word and a chord is a sentence and a musical passage is a paragraph, the scales are the grammar, the rules that we have to utilize when we write our music. You cannot get by without learning your scales. So every musician out there, download them from the internet, buy a book. Scales are vital to your playing. I suggest working at least 10-15 minutes a day on different scales. And another thing you want to learn is remember the simple rule that every mode or scale we use to solo over a chord must contain the elements of that chord. In our case, we use simple triads, 3 chords. In a 7th chord, you'll have another note added. You need to find scales that you can build that on. This is just the first step. We'll actually expand on this in upcoming lessons as time goes on. Personal note to all the players out there, if your practice sounds good every time you practice, you're practicing the wrong thing. And remember, live long and jam. And until next time, this is Sam Little.